have probably all seen the statistics. Around 700 million people worldwide face chronic hunger, and children die from malnutrition every day. Preventable deaths that wouldn't necessarily happen if resources were distributed differently. Organizations publish these numbers regularly, and we all read them and feel almost nothing. Or we might feel bad for a brief moment and share an article, but then go back and get some lunch and forget about it. But that does not mean that we are bad people, because everyone does it. But there is something disturbing about how easily we dismiss suffering that we would find absolutely intolerable if it were happening to someone we could actually see. Now, Peter Singer has a thought experiment that makes this disturbing gap impossible to ignore. I'm sure that some of y'all have heard this before, but imagine that you are walking past a shallow pond and you see a small child drowning. You could easily wade in and save them, but doing so would ruin your most expensive pair of shoes. Would you save the child? Well, of course you would. Anyone who wouldn't is kind of a moral monster. But the problem is that you could save a child's life right now by donating the cost of those expensive shoes to an effective charity that prevents malnutrition. The child dying of hunger is just as real as the one drowning in front of you. The only difference is that you can't see the other one. So why don't you donate? Why don't any of us? And more fundamentally, why do we care desperately about suffering that we can see, but remain almost completely indifferent to suffering that is abstract and distant, even when we know intellectually that the distant suffering is just as real and just as preventable? Well, philosophy has been grappling with this for pretty much forever, and the conclusion is pretty uncomfortable. Human moral psychology is fundamentally incapable of caring about large-scale or abstract suffering in the way that it cares about proximate and identifiable suffering. Or, in other words, we are not designed to respond to statistics or distant strangers. We respond to faces and proximity, and people that we can actually see and touch. And this is not a flaw that we can overcome through better education or more compelling campaigns. It is literally built into how human empathy and moral concern actually work, which means that problems like world hunger, which require sustained care about millions of faceless strangers, are problems that we are psychologically incapable of solving, even when we technically have the resources and knowledge to solve them. Joseph Stalin supposedly said, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." Now, whether he actually said this or not, the observation is psychologically accurate in a way that reveals something fundamental about human moral response. Research on what psychologists call psychic numbing or scope insensitivity shows that we are actually moved by individual identified victims, but become progressively less moved as the numbers increase. And the decrease is not proportional. If I tell you about one starving child and show you their photograph and name and tell you their life story, then you might start to feel some compassion, and you might even donate. But if I tell you about 2 starving children, you don't necessarily feel twice the compassion. And if I tell you about 1,000 or 1,000,000 starving kids, then you don't feel 1,000 or 1,000,000 times the compassion. In fact, you probably feel less than you did for the single identifiable child, because now it is an overwhelming abstraction, rather than a specific person that you can imagine helping. And this isn't because we're bad at math, or because we don't understand that more suffering is worse than less suffering. But it's because of a little thing called empathy, the emotional response that drives moral action for most people. Empathy does not necessarily scale the way it should. It responds to individuals, faces, and stories. And it shuts down when confronted with numbers that are too large to emotionally process. Heidegger's analysis of das Man, the they, helps explain why this happens. In everyday life, distant suffering remains abstract. They are hungry, people are starving, keeps the suffering at a distance, and it makes it a general fact about the world rather than a specific reality that demands our response. Hunger happens to they, the people in general, to populations, and they are statistics. Never to a specific person whose face you have seen and whose suffering you can viscerally imagine. When suffering remains in this abstract realm, then it doesn't trigger the moral response that proximity would. You know intellectually that each person in those statistics is as real as the drowning child in Singer's thought experiment. But you don't know it viscerally, in a way that would actually motivate action. So, the abstraction protects you from feeling what you would feel if you were confronted with that suffering directly. And this gets worse as the numbers increase. One child dying is something that you can imagine preventing, but 1 million children dying is so overwhelming that your mind cannot process it as 1 million individual tragedies. It becomes background noise and a fact about the world that you can do nothing about. Something that we all just learn to live with because the alternative, truly accepting and feeling the weight of that suffering, would be psychologically unbearable. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas argued that ethical obligation emerges from encountering the face of the other. Not face in the literal sense of facial features, but the irreducible presence of another person who calls you to responsibility. When you encounter someone face to face, their vulnerability and humanity make an ethical demand on you that you cannot ignore without explicitly refusing it. The starving person right in front of you makes a claim on you that abstract statistics cannot. And this explains why Singer's drowning child thought experiment actually works. When you can see the child drowning, and when you are physically present and the child's face is looking at you, refusing to help requires actively turning away from a person whose identity you cannot deny. The ethical demand is immediate and unavoidable, and most of us would not even think about the shoes that we're wearing or the $1,000 phone in our pockets. But the starving child on another continent, who you don't know and whose parents you have no idea, does not have a face that you can see. They remain abstract and part of a distant population that you can read about but never actually encounter. And because you never encounter their face, and they never become a specific person making a specific demand on you, the ethical obligation does not really feel real in the same way. And this matters because moral action for most people is driven by this kind of embodied encounter more than by abstract principle. We help people that we can see, people whose faces that make a claim on us. We do not help abstractions. Now, Adam Smith, better known for economics, made the observation in the theory of moral sentiments that is pretty relevant. He asks us to imagine that we learned about an earthquake destroying China and killing millions upon millions of people. Now, we would feel bad about this, and we would reflect on the fragility of human life. But by the next week, we would probably still be going about our daily business relatively unaffected. Schools probably wouldn't shut down, and we might raise a flag or two. But now imagine that you yourself, you are going to lose your little finger tomorrow. You would be pretty anxious and very preoccupied by this relatively minor personal misfortune in a way that you weren't preoccupied by millions of distant deaths. Smith is not saying that this is morally right, but just observing that this is how human moral psychology actually works. We care more about minor harms to ourselves and those close to us than about catastrophic harms to distant strangers. And while we can recognize intellectually that this is morally arbitrary, there is no good reason that your finger matters more than millions of lives. That intellectual recognition does not change how we feel or act, because this is the problem of moral distance. And this distance, even though it is morally arbitrary, allows us to ignore suffering in a way that we wouldn't be able to ignore the drowning child. The philosopher Thomas Nagel calls this moral luck. The way that morally arbitrary factors like where we were born and who we happen to encounter shape our moral obligations. We are not more responsible for the drowning child than the starving child just because we happen to walk past the pond. But the proximity makes it impossible to ignore our responsibility in one case while remaining easy to ignore it in the other. And so this creates the fundamental problem that morality as we conceive it requires impartiality. The suffering of a distant stranger is supposed to matter as much as the suffering of your neighbor, but human moral psychology is fundamentally partial. We are only ever going to care about the people that we can see, know, and whose suffering is immediate and concrete. And we will probably never care nearly as much about abstractions, even when we know that those abstractions represent equally real suffering. And no amount of empathy or education or pictures is going to make a real difference. And while many of us want to believe that problems like world hunger, global climate change, or any of these large, abstract problems are ever going to be solved, the reality of the situation is that because of human psychology and our relationship with what is close to us, these problems probably never will be solved. Even though every dollar that you spend on anything beyond basic necessities could literally save lives, and every hour that you spend on leisure could be spent earning money to donate or directly help others, the reality of the situation is you're probably going to spend your money on what matters to you, just like I would spend my money on what matters to me. And while there are people who donate the majority of their life savings to a good charity, almost nobody lives this way because human moral psychology cannot sustain it. We are social primates whose moral instincts evolved for small groups where everyone was proximate and identifiable. We care about our families, our friends, and our communities, people that we can see and who affect us directly. And we don't naturally care about distant strangers in the way that utilitarian ethics says that we should. And trying to force ourselves to care that way produces guilt and burnout rather than sustained action. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't donate to these causes when we can and when we think about it. But it does mean that people who try to make other people feel guilty for not doing things like this are simply blaming them for being human. And unfortunately, this means that the big problems in the world will probably never be solved at the rate that we think they should. So, with that said, thank you guys for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see y'all next time.